We're continuing today with our special series about Argentina.
¿Qué van a saber lo que es no tener para pagar una garrafa de invierno?
Compramos 300 vagones. Cada uno de estos vagones nos salió $1.090.000.
El peronismo es la búsqueda de las igualdades de oportunidades, la búsqueda de la justicia social, la búsqueda de la pobreza cero en Argentina.
Los argentinos queremos lo mismo, aunque pensemos distinto.
Argentina is one of the few countries in the world that is undergoing chronic inflation. Inflation that they just can't get rid of. When you look at the statistics, it leaves you speechless. The country has experienced high inflationary processes for at least the last 5 decades, 50 years. In fact, since the Central Bank of Argentina was created in 1935, the accumulated inflation amounts to this spectacular figure that you see on screen right now. That's a crazy 256,000 trillion%. This is the result of an average annual inflation of more than 60% since 1935. But why can't Argentines get rid of inflation? What role does the political class, business people, and citizens play in all of this? Why is the dollar so present in the minds of Argentines? Well, listen up. Dear viewer, first of all, we need to know exactly what we mean by inflation. It's often said that there's inflation when the prices of goods and services demanded by a country's population increase in a general manner. But why does it happen, and what causes this phenomenon? And here is where that special tool that we all use to make exchanges comes into play, and that, of course, is money. Everyone knows that money, currency, was historically metallic, and its value was given precisely by each metal's weight and composition, like copper, silver, or gold. But obviously, this wasn't very practical. So, over time, notes that could be converted into gold and silver began to be issued, as these were easier to carry, divide, and therefore use. The convertibility system was implemented until the 30s, when, due to the Great Depression, countries gradually began to abandon the convertibility system. Finally, in 1971, Richard Nixon gave it the final punch.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
From then on, the value of bills became completely dependent on the trust that the market had on the economic power, the solvency of the country that issued them. That's why the notes issued by the richest countries usually lead to the greatest value and confidence in the market. Meanwhile, governments no longer had to stockpile gold and silver to support their currency. The end of convertibility gave the governments the chance to use that old friend of ours as much as they wanted, and that's of course the bill printing machine. Up until then, if a government wanted to spend more, they either had to raise taxes or borrow money. However, the end of convertibility gave them another possibility: finance public spending with the creation of new money. That is what is popularly known as running the bill printing machine. The reality is that these days, all you need to do is push a key and boom, you've created all of the electronic money you could possibly want. Of course, this has consequences. If central banks are prudent and economic growth accompanies the issuance of new money, the effect of inflation won't be excessively damaging. But when governments pass that barrier, that's when a very, very serious problem begins. Suddenly, an artificial demand is created that pushes up the price of goods on the one hand, and on the other makes people lose confidence in that currency. The result? A bolting of inflation. Of course, the government responsible for this situation never wants to acknowledge its responsibility, which is why, in the end, it always ends up blaming entrepreneurs, accusing them of being speculators and of being greedy. So then comes the magic solution, which only makes things worse, and that's price controls.
Argentina unveils price controls to tame inflation.
And no, don't think this is a new idea. Not at all.
Price control in Argentina, a history repeated by different governments, from Perón to Alfonsín. Everyone tried to do the same and were never successful.
Y había que terminar con un flagelo que nos condena a todos por igual, y es el de la inflación. Y no hemos hecho nada nuevo en el tema cambiario, señor presidente.
Hammurabi's Code, unearthed in 1902, which was enacted before 2000 BC, set prices, wages, and interest rates, which means that price controls are at least 4,000 years old. Henry Hazlitt.
Of course, as this doesn't work either and prices go up even more, politicians usually start raising salaries through decrees and spending more on every kind of plan. And all of this is backed with even more unbacked money being issued. It's a vicious cycle that only leads to more and more inflation, which means destroying the value of savings, destroying a country's capital, annihilating legal security, preventing businesses from making calculations, which are vital for decisions, and depreciating the national currency. And few countries in the world know this process better than Argentina.
The land of inflation.
We've told you in several videos that Argentina's economic situation is terrifying.
Hoy estamos acá, no porque estemos en contra de nadie. Nosotros no somos anti nadie, estamos a favor de nuestro futuro porque creemos que merecemos vivir mejor.
Little work, low wages, high taxes, disastrous public accounts, and above all, a lot of inflation. Folks, Argentina's high inflationary process has been growing steadily since the 1950s.
Argentina on the podium. Year after year, inflation of 51.3% is the third highest in the world, behind only Venezuela and Zimbabwe.
Now can you see the process we just described? Who on earth is responsible for this inflationary spiral? Well, check out this chart prepared by the economist Nicholas Chakanowski, where we can see the lack of control that Argentina's public accounts are experiencing. As you can see, it doesn't matter who governs, military, civil, Peronist, or radical, the result is the same. Every Argentine government has devoted itself to spending uncontrollably, resorting to both issuing debt, first internal and then also external, as well as issuing money. And that's precisely what has caused Argentina's current economic disaster. Yes, you heard that right. Not imports, not vulture capitalism, not greedy businessmen. The truth is that these huge public deficits have been financed and continue to be financed with a huge external debt, very high inflation rates. That is, with the bill printing machine. Check out this table where you can see the average annual inflation rates that each Argentinian president has had since 1943. Some presidents weren't in power for long, even less than a year. Others were in the presidential chair for much longer. Presidents such as the well-known Perón, Videla, or Alfonsín, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, or Mauricio Macri were very different, but practically every president had something in common: very high inflation rates. This process has become so constant that Argentines are now used to living with huge inflation. Of course, that doesn't lessen their disastrous economic effects at all. Indeed, it can make it even worse. It's logical that when you get used to a quickly devaluing currency, all market participants act accordingly. Entrepreneurs try to compensate for risk, for example, by raising prices even more. The unions demand wage increases just in case, and the government, in an attempt to compensate for all the economic and social problems that have emerged, keep approving all kinds of regulations, issuing debt in foreign currency, because of course the time comes when local financial markets no longer serve any purpose and continue to run the bill printing machine. And the problem just accumulates and continues, a kind of race organized and driven by politicians in which all participants lose, especially the poorest, those who depend on their salary to survive. And we can't fool ourselves. A clear result of high inflation is that it destroys a country's competitiveness. How? Well, first by consuming its savings, the local capital. And then, when governments introduce restrictions of all kinds to deal with the uncontrolled price increases, that ends up creating unstable industries and economies that can't compete in the world. This, folks, is precisely what is happening in Argentina, and that's why Argentina can't get out of a crisis without getting into another one. Because we're talking about more than 50 years of mistakes here. It just seems that Argentinian politicians, they just don't learn.
Recurrent fiscal deficit. In 2018, the state covered only 85% of its expenses with actual income. Argentina. Debt is now close to 97.7% of the country's GDP and is the highest in the region.
Now the question is, do Argentinians have any defense mechanism? Is there an instrument that can help them protect themselves from the stubbornness of politicians? And yes, in a certain way there is actually one, so listen up.
The dollar world.
You don't need to be an economist to know that having savings in Argentine pesos is a very, very bad idea. It's something that those of you who follow us from Argentina will probably know. So if your currency is losing value by the day in such a significant way, then you have no choice but to look for another currency to better preserve the value of your savings. And in Argentina's case, and for virtually every other country in the world with the same problem, that currency is the US dollar.
The Argentine economy is de facto dollarized. It must be done for real. Roberto Kachanowski.
In Argentina, it's usual for everyone to know the exchange rate of the dollar to the Argentine peso. And for Argentinians, the dollar is important for several reasons. First, because the price of products is closely linked to the price of the dollar. Allow me to explain. Argentina imports several goods, and with their own currency, the peso, losing so much value so quickly, practically everything is traded in dollars, which is also the international reserve currency. This also happens with Argentine exports. The dollar is more stable and ultimately becomes the reference unit. Prices in pesos are like a crazy thermometer that changes temperature constantly. Secondly, and most importantly, the dollar is a currency that allows Argentinians to maintain the value of their savings. Yes, it's true that the dollar also suffers from inflation, but it's in proportions that can't really be compared to the Argentine peso. For example, in 2001, if we had saved 20,000 pesos in a drawer, that would be enough at the time for the average car. By 2019, with that same amount of money, we could hardly afford a smartphone, and no, it wouldn't be an iPhone. The loss of value of the Argentine peso is simply spectacular. So that explains why in countries with high inflation, the dollar circulates almost as if it were a national currency. It happens in Argentina, and even North Korea uses dollars. Since 1950, Argentina has barely managed to go 10 years between 1993 and 2002 with inflation at moderate levels below 4%. That's only 10 years in almost 7 decades. Thus, Argentina has become one of the few countries in the world that can't control its inflation. And make no mistake, the solution is clear. Reduce public spending, balance budgets, and stop being so dependent on the central bank. Politicians know this. The question is, why on earth don't they implement it? And this leads me to another question. Will Argentinian politicians be able to end this eternal spiral of inflation? Well, leave your answer in the comments below, as well as in this survey, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, please do check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please do consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.